So I think we will go ahead and get started. I don't know about on your screen, but this is Jason Edens. Jason spent 4 years living in rural Japan as an employee of the Ministry of Education. He was charged with developing English curriculum for public rural high schools. He had the opportunity to visit countless communities around Japan and peer behind the silk curtain. Based in Fukushima, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Japan, Jason nearly made Japan his permanent home. And now we're blessed to have Jason Edens as an instructor at Central Lakes College. So please welcome me in joining Jason Edens. And I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you. And yeah, good to go.
Thank you, Tracy. 皆様、こんにちは。私はジェイソン・イーデンズです。セントラルレイクス大学で環境学の教えることは私の特権です。ご参加いただければ幸いです。Hello, friends and fellow travelers. I just told you that my name is Jason Edens and that it's my privilege to teach environmental studies at Central Lakes College, and I'm so glad that you could join us. It's also my privilege to share with you a little bit about my experience living and working in Japan, which, as Tracy mentioned, I had the opportunity to do for nearly 4 years. And before I begin, though, it's really important that I share a couple concerns, caveats, and conditions with you. For those of you who haven't noticed yet, I'm not Japanese, nor am I Japanese American. And so what I intend to share with you is simply my perspective, some of my observations, and my experience in Japan. And if you ask another 100 Americans who have had the opportunity to live and work in Japan, I can assure you that you will get 100 different opinions compared to what I'm about to share with you. More importantly, if you were to ask, say, 100 Japanese about what I'm about to share with you, you'll probably hear 100 different ways in which I'm wrong or mistaken. So please bear in mind that I'm simply sharing with you my experience, and I'm a little bit sensitive about speaking or representing a country that, of course, isn't mine. And then finally, I have to point out that it's virtually impossible for me to do justice to Japan over the course of an hour. So please bear in mind, please understand that we will merely be scratching the surface. This is the tip of the proverbial iceberg. So consider this a trailer, a teaser, just an introduction to some things that are Japanese. And then also, I just want to say that I really wish we could be having this conversation in person. And it might seem a little bit odd to be talking about international travel under these circumstances. I don't believe that anyone's going to go to the Japanese New Year's festivals, which are a huge event in Japan, over the course of the next month. That would be potentially difficult or even foolhardy. But having said that, it is clear to me that people will be traveling to Japan again in the near future. And a great example of that is the International Olympic Committee and Japan are moving ahead, full steam ahead, in order to host the Olympics this summer. So even though it doesn't seem as if we're able to travel right now, we certainly will be, and I would encourage all of you to put Japan on your bucket list. So in lieu of traveling, let me do a little bit of armchair adventuring on your behalf. So with that, our journey in Japan begins in Fukushima. If that sounds familiar to you, it should. Fukushima was, of course, home to the now infamous Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. That's the town I lived in. I lived in that town. And I'll talk briefly later about the actual nuclear disaster. But Fukushima is about 5 hours north of Tokyo, and it's in a rural part of Japan that's typically called Tohoku. And northern Japan is a very beautiful place, and that's where I was based. And my job, my responsibility was to support both native and non-native English speakers at public rural high schools in the development of English curriculum. And that gave me the unique and treasured opportunity to travel the country and meet with students, with teachers, and with community members. And it's something that has immeasurably changed and shaped my life. So for those of you that are taking your first foray into all things Japanese, I thought we would start by a brief comparison. So what you see in front of you, hopefully, is on the right side, you see an outline of the country of Sweden. It's superimposed over a map of the western part of the United States. And of course, just to the left of it is California, and just to the left of it is Japan, of course. And I bring this up because I want to demonstrate the fact that Japan is a very densely populated country. Sweden has, again, an area that's similar to Japan, but it has a population that's roughly twice what Minnesota's population is. California, on the other hand, again, is similar in size to Japan, has 40 million people. Japan is home to 124 million people and is certainly among the most densely populated countries on the planet. And that brings me to the very first myth that I would like to bust. So over the course of the next half an hour or so, it's my hope that I can share a couple misperceptions that I had and help you understand that some of the myths that some of us have aren't as accurate as we might think. So before I went to Japan, I had a wide variety of generalizations and assumptions about Japan, one of which was that Japan is a concrete jungle. And the picture that you see here is Tokyo, which is the world's largest city. In fact, 37 million Japanese live in the capital city of Tokyo. That's basically the entire population of California in one city. So there's no doubt there is a lot of concrete jungle in Japan. And in fact, it's hard to be hyperbolic about Tokyo. Tokyo is an incredible city, and the entire city is really a feat of engineering and a testament to the technological prowess of the Japanese people. Take, for example, the metro or the subway system. Some subway stations have 7 layers of subways stacked on top of one another. So you can literally be 7 stories beneath the earth and boarding one of many subways that are actually above you. So the city, again, from stormwater management to emergency response to public transportation, is in and of itself a feat of engineering that's unparalleled on the planet. But despite the fact that there are a variety of large urban areas, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kyoto, there are very large cities in Japan, but one thing that many folks don't realize is that 70% of the land area of Japan is actually forested, and heavily forested, in fact. I personally, here in Minnesota, I live in the sticks. I live outside of Bacchus, Minnesota. And one of the things I love about Minnesota is the fact that it's heavily forested. And one of the things that helped me love Japan so much was the fact that it's a very wild country. There is beautiful wilderness. Again, with 70% of the country covered with forest, there's no shortage of national parks, no shortage of opportunities to get out into nature, if you will. And so while I was living there, I made it a point to hike and bike the country, and never in my life have I been so lost. So it is not a concrete jungle, in fact, and it's also not an accident that Japan is so heavily forested. And I find this to be a really interesting aspect of Japanese history. At the end of the 16th century, in the beginning of the 17th century, Japan was facing an ecological crisis. There's no other way to describe it. The entire country had been deforested, denuded of its forests, and as a result, there were more landslides. It was an ecological disaster. And at that time, Emperor Tokugawa instituted what is arguably the first national sustainable forestry initiative. And under his administration, the country was reforested to about 70% of the land area. And because of that initiative, it has remained stable at about 70% since his reign in the mid-17th century. So Japan is not a concrete jungle, but instead is home to some of the world's most beautiful forests. And you can see another pagoda hidden in this forest in this slide. It's also home to some of the largest and oldest trees and oldest living organisms on the planet. What you see in front of you is a tree called the Jomon sugi, or the Jomon cedar tree. And it's an 1,000-year-old tree that I had the privilege of seeing in person. So that first myth about Japan being a concrete jungle, there are large cities without a doubt, but there's also vast wildlands in Japan. And I'm not sure that many folks are aware of that. I wasn't as aware of that until I had the opportunity to live there. Another myth is that Japan is somehow homogenous. And the picture that you see in front of you is the student body of one of the schools that I visited. And obviously all the students are in uniform. And there is a lot of uniformity in Japan, and schools are probably the best example of where that uniformity is seen. But having said that, very few countries are as diverse as the United States. Arguably, there is no country as diverse as the United States. But Japan is much less homogenous than I thought. And I found that most Japanese are actually marching to the beat of their own drum. They're critical thinkers, they're independent thinkers, and they're also eccentric, idiosyncratic, eclectic, fun. As you can see here, this Pokemon wedding. So from wedding planners to international athletes, the people of Japan are incredibly diverse and obviously very warm, and it's a much less homogenous country than most people think. In my opinion, it's much less monolithic. There's an incredible amount of artistic diversity, cultural diversity, political diversity, diversity of interests and experiences. So it's one of the other myths that I think is important to potentially break a little bit. Another misperception that I had was that Japan was of maybe one or two faiths. And the gentlemen that you see here are some Buddhist monks who were kind enough to let me stay at their temple for several nights as I was passing through. And there certainly are a lot of Buddhists in Japan. In fact, about 70% of the Japanese population self-identifies as Buddhist. And you see a lot of Buddhist monastics seeking alms on the street. This is a very common sight. So there's no doubt that Buddhism has an enormous influence on the country of Japan, and there are a lot of Buddhists. But interestingly, 70% of Japanese also self-identify as Shinto. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Shinto is basically the indigenous native religion of Japan. It is animist, essentially. That's a gross oversimplification, but essentially it's reverence for nature. So, which is also an oversimplification, but Shinto is the indigenous religion, and 70% of Japanese also identify as Shinto. So that's some fuzzy math. If 70% identify as Buddhists and 70% identify as Shinto, that's 140%. Well, the point that I'm trying to make here is many Japanese don't see world faiths as mutually exclusive. And this was a real interesting learning for me. But instead, they see them more as complementary or additive. And so as a result, it's not uncommon to meet Japanese that have espoused a wide variety of world faiths and practice those faiths. One conversation that I'll never forget, I asked a Japanese woman if she was a Buddhist, and she said yes. I then asked her if she was Shinto. She said, of course. I then asked her if she was Christian. She said, absolutely. So interestingly, Japanese don't always see world faiths as mutually exclusive, but rather, again, as complementary. Now, having said that, there are, of course, many Japanese that are exclusively Buddhist or exclusively Shinto or exclusively Christian. But a lot of Japanese choose to espouse these different religions at different times. And that's one of the ways in which this unfolds in day-to-day life. So, for example, different life rites are honored by different religions in Japan. Funerals are often, not always, but are often Buddhists. And weddings are often, but not always, Shinto. So that's one way in which Japanese will, for lack of a better term, pick and choose from various world religions. So I found that to be a very interesting aspect of Japanese culture. Another myth that you may have, or a perception rather, is that all Japanese live in microscopic nano apartments. I had that impression, and I wasn't disappointed because I was assigned to what they call a rabbit hutch, a very small one-room apartment. But most of the small apartments that we have heard about or see in the media are in the large urban areas. In rural Japan, actually, it's the exact opposite. It's not uncommon in rural Japan for families to live in large, spacious homes. Why? Families typically live in an extended family arrangement. So many families include grandparents and grandkids, mom and dad, uncle and auntie, sometimes even more. So as a result, the homes are, in rural Japan in particular, very spacious, even almost like a labyrinth. So this notion that Japanese dwellings are all these microscopic nano apartments or rabbit hutches is really false. And in fact, a lot of rural Japanese homes have dozens of rooms, but they're usually centered around the hearth. So this here is a traditional dining and cooking area. And although these are becoming less common, and although most Japanese typically dine at a Western table, like most of us, a lot of Japanese still dine at the tatami mat, which is the floor mat that you see before you. So this is a very common feature in a lot of rural Japanese homes. Japanese rural homes are not only spacious, but as you can see here, they're absolutely gorgeous. The architecture in Japan, again, in my humble opinion, is unparalleled, and the craftspersonship of the construction of these homes is absolutely jaw-dropping. Now, it's interesting, I'm sure most of you are aware of the fact that when you're entering a Japanese home, the custom is to shed or to slough off your outside shoes. Many of us have adopted that here in the United States. But what you might not realize is it's actually more complex than that. And let me explain this to you in terms of schools. So think about the high school that you attended. Maybe there were 50 people in your class, maybe there were 500 people in your class. Well, that's true in Japan as well. There are smaller rural schools and larger urban schools. Regardless, when the student body enters the school at the beginning of the school day, everyone takes off their shoes. And as you enter the genkan, which is the entryway for a home or a business or a school, you take off your shoes. And in schools, there are these massive banks of lockers specifically for students to shed their shoes and put on their inside shoes. But it's actually more complex than that because your inside shoes cannot be worn everywhere in the school or in the home. There are places within the home or businesses or schools that even the inside shoes are then shed yet again. So for example, if you sit down on a tatami mat, you're not wearing any footwear. Again, the tatami mats were seen in the previous slide in the family hearth. Unfortunately, a lot of folks that visit Japan don't realize this upon arrival, and my mom was no exception. So one time my mom and I were traveling in Japan and we stayed at an inn, a traditional inn, and at a traditional inn, everyone dines together, usually for breakfast. And the dining room or the cafeteria, for lack of a better term, is also covered with tatami mats. Well, my mom, not knowing any better, and well, me not telling her any better, she simply sauntered onto the tatami mat with her shoes, and you could hear the gasp when everyone noticed what she was doing. And then you could have heard a pin drop. And so I had to quickly escort her off of the tatami mats and apologize to a bunch of strangers. So although everyone takes their shoes off, there are also places where there's no footwear worn whatsoever. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring up the housing stock in rural Japan is because Japan has very little income inequality. In other words, there's a lot of equality in terms of the amount of money that people earn, regardless of what they do. So there's very little disparity in pay. And obviously, this bar graph is a gross oversimplification, but you can see that there are very, very few low-income communities in Japan, and there are very few uber rich or extremely affluent communities in Japan. Japan is mostly middle class. So therefore, families have the ability to own homes that may have both decorative and productive gardens. But another thing that's interesting about home ownership in Japan is that if a family owns a home, it's quite likely that that home has been in the family for centuries, literally centuries, maybe 500 years. And this is interesting because it's not unlike an article that you might have seen in the New York Times yesterday that talked about some of the oldest businesses in the world. They're in Japan. There are 19 businesses that are over 1,000 years old and have been in continuous operation. And there are dozens and dozens of businesses that are 500 years old, and there are thousands of businesses that are more than 100 years old. So some of the oldest businesses on the planet are in Japan. Even Nintendo, for example, is 131 years old, and it started out by making playing cards. So if you own a home in Japan, it may very well have been in the family for quite some time. Here, with these last two pictures of homes, you can see that some of the homes are still using thatch or a traditional roofing material. This is becoming increasingly rare, not because people don't want it, but because of the product, the source of that thatch is becoming increasingly rare in Japan. Now, another myth that's a little bit more thorny is that all Japanese have a reverence for nature. I certainly had that impression. When I first encountered Japan in elementary school, that was essentially the message. And it's one of the things that led me to curiosity about Japan. But now, having lived there for many years, it's a little bit more complex. In fact, I would say that there are Japanese that have a blatant disregard for nature or for the environment. One of the interesting ways to demonstrate that's the case is most cities are immaculate, absolutely spotless. Large cities, small villages, they're typically incredibly immaculate. However, in between towns or cities, it's not uncommon to find beaches or ditches that are full of trash. And it's also not uncommon for someone to step into their car and put on their driving shoes so that they don't have their outside shoes inside the car. And then as they're driving over a mountain pass or beside a seaside estuary, they wouldn't even think twice about flippantly discarding a coffee cup or a pop can out the window. So it's interesting because there's a lot of reverence in literature, in art, in everyday life. And yet there's also a lot of negligence for protecting that nature. And as the environmental studies instructor here at Central Lakes College, I wanted to incorporate some of that into our discussion today. Some of the perceptions that you may have and some of the perceptions that I have are in fact true. One of which is that the ancient arts and crafts are alive and well. There is no doubt about this. There are thousands and thousands of uniquely Japanese arts and crafts. And I would say the arts and crafts movement, if you will, has its oldest example in Japan. So all across the country, if you live in a village, if you live in the heart of the beast in Tokyo, there are opportunities to learn and to study a wide variety of arts and crafts. And I'm not referring to the expats like me, the folks that are there for a brief period of time, but of course for the Japanese. And one of the reasons this is an option for Japanese is because it's a priority of the national government. The national government makes opportunities available for people of all ages, all across the country. And so I want to share a couple of those with you. Here is an art called Kyudo, which is Japanese archery. It's one of a couple different types of archery. And this was in a nearby town, and I had the opportunity to go and shoot with these gentlemen a couple times. And one thing that's interesting about the arts and crafts in Japan is that there's a very long learning curve. And the apprenticeship program in Japan is ancient. And so whether you're making kokeshi dolls or doing Ikebana, flower arranging, you can spend your entire life learning these crafts. And the philosophical masters of these crafts would absolutely acknowledge that they have barely scratched the surface. And the amount that you can learn and study is infinity plus one. So again, whether it's kokeshi dolls or sumo wrestling, all of these crafts have the opportunity to study for years and years and years. And speaking of sumo, sumo is not something that just takes place on the TV, but rather there are local stables all across Japan, and there happened to be one relatively close to where I was living. And it was fun to go and watch the scrimmages at the sumo stable. And a fun fact about sumo, as part of their study, they have to drink beer. It's part of their diet in order to obtain the physique for their craft. So if you brought beer to the stable, you definitely had the opportunity to stick around for a while. Or maybe it's taisho goto, which is one of the many stringed instruments in Japan. There are all of these arts, and again, this is encouraged, it's supported, it's part of elder care, it's part of education, it's woven into nearly every aspect of life. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to study Aikido, Shorinji Kempo, Shoji, a wide variety of arts. And so this is something that is very true when people think about Japan. Or maybe it's making sake. As you may know, the national drink of Japan is a rice wine called sake, and it too is an ancient, ancient craft that takes a lifetime to master. Or perhaps it's making yukata or kimono, as you can see here. And one of the things I really enjoy about this picture is it looks like the elder of the two is not too terribly excited to be there, whereas her younger sister is very excited. So this too, making kimono or the tea ceremony, of course, is live and well, and there are people that facilitate it, and there are many Japanese that want to participate in it, and it's a regular occurrence. And it even translates into the home, the way in which tea is served in the home. So these ancient traditions, these ancient arts and crafts are very much alive and well in Japan. Here's an example of an Ikebana, and this is in the home. People are doing these crafts in the home. This is a small meditation chamber at a home, which is an uncommon thing. There are a lot of shrines in homes from multiple faiths. Now, some of these arts and crafts, though, are admittedly dying. One such craft was armor making. But the folks that still have these skills that are ancient are designated as national living treasures. And there was a gentleman that lived in a town that was nearby where I lived, and he was such a national living treasure. And I suspect that came with a living wage or some sort of remuneration because it was his profession. But it also was probably a pressure cooker. I'm not sure if I ever saw him sober, but he was one of many national living treasures who continue to carry on these ancient traditions. And I believe there were just a handful of people that were still skilled enough in metalworking to create traditional Japanese armor. Now, no conversation about Japan is complete without a discussion about the Japanese hot springs. So as you might know, Japan is on the Ring of Fire, which is a large part of the globe that literally encircles the Pacific Ocean. So Chile, Mexico, California, Alaska, parts of Russia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and of course Japan, where there's a great deal of seismic activity and a great deal of volcanic activity. These are all at the edges of plates. So because of that, Japan is literally pockmarked with hot springs from the northern reaches to the southern reaches. And all of these hot springs are turned into public baths. And this is a fantastic aspect of Japan. And if any of you have the opportunity to go, I would strongly encourage that you prioritize some time at a traditional inn or just to visit a Japanese hot spring. Because one of the things that's really interesting about the Nihon no Onsen, the Japanese onsen that you see in front of you, is that these are made for the people. This is not something that's only accessible to the elite or to the wealthy. This is something that's made accessible to everyone. I tend not to use superlatives like everyone or always, but in this case, everyone has the opportunity to enjoy a Japanese bath. So although staying at the inn that might be part of this onsen or this hot spring will set you back a couple $100, just going to use the bath is nearly free. Just for a modest token, a buck or two, you can spend all day soaking in this bath. So the Japanese onsen or the Japanese hot springs are something that are made for the people, and they're therapeutic also. And oftentimes, different pools have different minerals, and so they're used for different therapies as well. But one thing that's interesting and very important is that Japanese have ritualized bathing and turned it to the highest of art form. So first and foremost, no one ever steps into these baths without becoming sparkling clean. In other words, the bathing process or the washing process actually takes place elsewhere. The bathing in these pools is literally just for soaking. Now, you might be wondering, why are there no people in these pictures? And by the way, the vast majority of the pictures that I'm sharing with you are pictures that I've taken, so I apologize if they're grainy. Some of these are actual photographs, if you remember those. So why are there no pictures, or people rather, in these pictures? Well, one, they're often co-ed. Two, you don't wear clothing. So it'd be inappropriate for me to show the fact that these are usually full of people. So the Japanese onsen is a very inexpensive way to experience something that is uniquely Japanese and an incredible experience on the planet. Another thing I wanted to briefly talk about is food production in Japan, because I learned a great deal about self-sufficiency from living in Japan. And Japan is not the most self-sufficient internationally in terms of domestic food production, but it is self-sufficient in terms of rice production. Japan produces 98% of all the rice that is consumed in the country. So it's achieved a high level of self-sufficiency in the base grain of its people. And of course, rice is a staple with most all meals. And I too have adopted a lot of the Japanese traditions around eating and had the good fortune of having a Japanese breakfast this morning, which of course featured prominently rice. Rice production takes place anywhere it can, as you can see from this picture. This shows a small village in northern Japan where there's a very small amount of relatively flat land. That arable land was turned into rice paddies. It's also not uncommon for individual families to have their own rice paddy. You and I might have a kitchen garden, but it's very common for rural Japanese to have a multitude of rice paddies for their own consumption, for their own families. And rice production is interesting because, of course, Japan is a highly industrialized country. It's a high-tech country, and it's a highly mechanized country. But the rice production remains a relatively simple process. A lot of fields, or paddies rather, are still seeded by hand. A lot of it's still harvested by hand. A lot of it is dried by hand, as you can see here. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. Much in the same way that some of those homes that I shared with you, although they look very traditional, every one of those homes probably had a multitude of flat screen TVs. It probably had multiple gaming systems and maybe a modest home theater, gizmos galore. So there's a real interesting juxtaposition in Japan between the traditional and the modern, and you see it everywhere. Japan also, of course, produces a lot of food from the sea. On a per capita basis, Japan consumes more seafood than any other country on the planet by a factor of 2. And for those of you that like sushi rolls, what you see in front of you is a nori field, the growing of nori, a type of seaweed that's used throughout Japanese cuisine. And of course, it's probably most familiar to you from sushi rolls. And a fun fact about sushi, sushi, by the way, some of you probably do know this, sushi is not raw fish, that's sashimi. Sushi is vinegared rice. So when you hear the term sushi, it doesn't necessarily mean raw fish or fish at all. Japanese cuisine, well, we could study this for 80 years. And I can merely say that the food is incredible and it's so diverse. Each and every village has its own unique delicacy. So it's impossible to learn all about Japanese cuisine and various foods, because if you travel from village to village to village, you will encounter new food every time. And in terms of vegetable production, vegetable stands are ubiquitous, absolutely everywhere. So many people make ancillary income, additional income from having a vegetable plot, and so fresh produce is everywhere. And Japan has a very incredibly healthy diet and a very, in terms of lifespan, Japanese live longer than a lot of other people on the planet. And that's partially due to the fact that they have a very diverse very diverse diet. Now, speaking of food, one of the experiences that I want to share with you is around noodles. As I'm sure you know, Japanese, like many East Asians, eat a lot of noodles. And this is a soba noodle right here, which is made from buckwheat, partially from buckwheat. And there are a variety of noodles that you're familiar with, ramen, udon. All of these are Japanese noodles, or at least there are Japanese versions of those noodles. One time, when I was first arriving and going to some of the schools that I served, I walked into a cafeteria. And I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit more about the schools in just a moment. But one of the experiences I had was I walked into a school, and of course, all the students are dining together. And in Japan, it is polite, it is considered polite to lift your bowl and to slurp your noodles as vigorously as you want and as loudly as you want. And that's often considered a compliment. Well, I don't know what the sound of one hand clapping is, but I do know what the sound of 150 students slurping soba is. Just imagine, let that marinate in your mind for a moment. It's a loud cafeteria. As we've discussed, Japan is highly technical, highly industrialized, and as a result, it consumes an enormous amount of energy, both at the national level and also on a per capita basis. So Japan is a very energy consumptive country. And up until 2011, nuclear energy figured very prominently in how the energy needs of the country were met. It had one of the larger percentages of nuclear energy relative to other countries. France, of course, is nearly entirely powered by nuclear energy, but Japan was also powered significantly by nuclear energy. Well, that all changed. And that all changed because of the 2011 earthquake and subsequent tsunami or tidal wave. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning, for those of you that weren't here with the greeting, I lived in this town. And what's left of the reactor is something that I rode my bike by every single day to catch a train, although it looked entirely different. And in fact, it was a really fun thing to do when people came to visit, was to go on a tour of the nuclear power plant. Well, that nuclear power plant, of course, is still very much of a going concern. And that issue is long from over. Unfortunately, the news cycle is such that we don't hear about this nearly as much anymore, but it's very much of a going concern right now. And what I wanted to share with you is that in Japan, a densely populated country, it's very difficult to relocate people, especially people that have lived in that community for hundreds and hundreds of years, or their families have. Right now, a lot of the folks that were students or fellow teachers or community members or grandmas that adopted me while I was living there, they're all environmental refugees because there's an exclusion zone now around the town and the communities where I lived where people can't live because it's simply unsafe. The radiation is too high. So in Japan now, there are hundreds of thousands of people that have been forced to flee and live elsewhere. And Japan is such a place-based society. That's a huge societal and social challenge. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. And many of the folks that were near and dear to my heart when I lived there, I frankly don't know if they're alive or not, some of them. So I just wanted to say rest in power in honor of those folks. I want to talk a little bit about education in the few minutes that we have left here. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down was my impression of the public school system. Now, at first, you might think to yourself, that has nothing but negative connotations. And there certainly is a way in which it does. However, what's interesting is that the schools are very much owned by the students, and the students work very hard for everyone to succeed. Everyone to succeed. And I had the misperception initially while I was there that critical thinking was squashed, that there was no room for dissent, that there was no room to tackle the world's thorniest issues in class. I was gravely mistaken. And I'm very happy to share with you that Japanese are encouraged to think critically at a very young age. And I have one final example of that at the very end of my presentation that I'm looking forward to sharing with you. But there are two other aspects of the Japanese education system. And again, we could talk about this for so long, but there are just two things that I want to share with you. One is called soji. Soji is the daily cleaning of the schools. Let me start by saying this. There is 0 custodial staff at public schools in Japan. There are no custodians, 0. There are no mechanics. The students clean and maintain their schools top to bottom, entirely. Every single day we would perform soji. If I was at a school, I was part of soji. If you're on campus, you're expected to pick up a broom, pick up a towel, and start cleaning. And that means every corner. And what's interesting is this cultivates, as you might imagine, a sense of ownership and a sense of pride. Now, is this a national mandate? Nope. There is no governmental mandate that says students have to do this. Every public school does this on a daily basis. Elementary school, junior high school, high school. So soji is a really interesting thing because it's one of the things that I would have liked to have brought back as an educator. I think this really helps. It'd be interesting to know how the American student's mindset would change regarding school if this were a part of our daily educational system. Again, students have a remarkable sense of ownership of their schools, partially because of this aspect of the education. But it goes further. Students are also not only responsible for cleaning the school, they're also responsible for feeding one another on a rotational basis. And again, that's at elementary school, junior high school, and high school. Is there support from the teachers and the staff? The teachers? Yes, of course. But it is the students doing the work. So as they rotate, different classes are responsible for feeding the rest of the school on a daily basis. And it builds a unique sense of community and camaraderie. And it was one of the many aspects of Japanese educational system that I really appreciated. And this was the environment in which I learned what 150 students slurping soba noodles sounds like. So with that, I have the privilege of ending today's conversation with a formal gift from some of my colleagues in Japan. And I mentioned earlier that critical thinking is encouraged. I had the misperception when I was there initially that there wasn't a great deal of critical thinking in the schools and that there was very little room for dissent. That's not the case. And a very powerful example is in May, with the murder of George Floyd here in Minnesota and the subsequent conversations that have taken place all across the country. This was a huge topic of conversation in Japanese schools, a very big topic, not just in current events in high school or social studies or something like that. It was discussed in elementary school. Equity was discussed in elementary school. Diversity was discussed. Learning how to de-escalate was discussed. And so as a result, I was approached recently by some of my former colleagues in Japan, and they said they wanted to offer a gift to the people of the United States. And being one of their few contacts here, they approached me, and the gift that is to be given is 1,000 paper origami cranes. And there's a very brief history of this. It actually is ancient. The crane is a mythological creature in Japan. It's expected to live 1,000 years mythically. And it's a long-standing tradition to give origami for people that are suffering or not well, or even for sports teams that they want to succeed. So it's a token of goodwill, it's a token of hope, it's a token of healing. But the story becomes more acute with the bombing of Hiroshima. And the young woman that you see memorialized in this sculpture was 2 when the bomb was dropped, and she was 12 when she died of leukemia. But shortly before she died, she started a tradition of folding 1,000 paper cranes in the hope that she might survive. And that tradition has lasted since. And to this day, people make bouquets, if you will, of 1,000 folded cranes as a gift to those people that have experienced hurt or suffering, or as a token of goodwill. So here's what it's called, senbuzuru, which is 1,000 origami cranes. And it's my privilege to show you the gift that is being offered to Central Lakes College. So here are elementary school students who have just completed a discussion, a unit on George Floyd, racial equity, de-escalation, and violence in America. And the students, not the teachers, took the initiative to make 1,000 paper cranes, but they didn't know where to deliver them. And so they contacted me. The woman that you see at the front of the class is a former colleague, and she contacted me and said, where could we possibly send this? And so I inquired at Central Lakes College, and I'm very pleased to share with you that this will be displayed as a token of goodwill from the Japanese people to all Americans, regardless of your background, as a gesture of hope and healing for our future. So with that, I would love to take some questions, and I very much appreciate everyone's interest in Japan and the time that you've taken out of your busy schedules today.
Thank you so much. Jason Edens, that was simply fascinating, incredible. I learned so much. I'm waiting for your questions. If you have questions, you can certainly enter them in the Q&A, or if you'd like to enter them in the chat, we've got an eye on that as well. I had a question, and all of your information was so interesting, I lost it. So there's a lot of things coming in. There's a question, where will the 1,000 cranes be displayed at CLC?
Well, that's very timely, because we just learned today that they will be displayed, I believe it's called the South Hall. Is that the South Hallway? Is that correct?
That's
Tracy?
right. Yep. Yep.
Okay. Yep. And there'll be a placard there that explains the origin story of the cranes, its cultural significance. And then what we're also trying to do is get a video from one of these students, which is a how-to fold an origami crane, and that'll be part of their English curriculum. So in other words, they'll be explaining how to do this in English, and we hope to have a little maybe video portal there where you can learn how to make a crane yourself.
All right, there's a question. Has Japan retreated from its reliance on nuclear power since the Fukushima accident?
Significantly. In fact, it's my understanding that there's only one reactor that's still in operation, and immediately after the Fukushima disaster, all of the nuclear plants across the country were idled. Now, of course, there's no off switch with nuclear power entirely, so those reactors are still there, the fuel rods are still there, but most of those plants have been idled, and the solar energy industry is rapidly growing to backfill some of that capacity. But there's also been a surge in the use of conventional fossil fuels to power Japan. It's a very energy hungry country.
So I've got a hand raised, and I just cannot get to my, oh, here we go. I'm going to see if I can. Okay, Wendy, you can go ahead and ask your question. Unmute yourself, and I think you're going to come on as a panelist. Hopefully this works. As she's making her way on, hopefully. There's another question regarding the nuclear accident. Has it impacted the fishing industry?
It has, and there is essentially no fishing industry in close proximity to Fukushima, but because it's a densely populated country and because there's so many municipalities in close proximity to one another, there are still fishing fleets that are definitely harvesting in close proximity. And with the currents and the movement of the water around Fukushima, it's hard to say whether or not there's ionizing radiation or radiation. I would be reluctant to eat anything within 100 miles of Fukushima.
So Wendy Adamson, if you would like to, let's see here. You may need to unmute yourself, but you can go ahead and ask that question. Sometimes questions are a little bit more complicated to be able to put into text, but I'm not seeming to have much luck here. I'm asking her to unmute, but I am so sorry.
Would it help if I stopped sharing my screen? Would that facilitate it?
Possibly. You know, as so ask to unmute. Still not working. I have a question. What was your favorite place coming
Oh
in?
my gosh. That's an impossible question. I would say just generally northern rural Japan because of the fact that it busted the myth that I had. And it's just such an incredibly beautiful part of the world. Some random rural village in northern Japan is probably my favorite place.
One attendee is saying, please express our appreciation of the gift of cranes. And so that, we're hoping at the college to have students participate in maybe some creative act so that we can reciprocate and show our appreciation for this gift really of love and goodwill. Um, there's a question about language. Can you tell us about learning the Japanese language?
I can. I loved the language, and I have a love for languages, but I really fell in love with the Japanese language, and I really enjoyed learning the kanji, the characters. And I have a very quick story about the characters since you brought up language. One of the principals of the schools that I visited regularly was also a lover of language, and he brought me into his office and he sat me down. And I'm going to be brief here, and he gave me two lists of words. One was in English and one was in Japanese, and they contained the same words in different order. The words in English were very difficult. They were scientific, they were technical, they were very challenging, they were medical, they were very challenging words. And he said, just explain these to me in Japanese and I will determine whether or not you know the meaning of these English words. So I tried to explain to him as many as I knew, and I think I got about 5 out of 20. Then he gave me the same list in a different order in Japanese, and I got about 17 out of 20. They were the same words, the same level of difficulty. And the reason is simply because you can deduce meaning from the characters. If you understand the origin of the different components of the characters, then you can actually stitch together the meaning. And so that's one of the things that I really enjoyed. But another thing that I wanted to share, and again, this was my challenge, was deciding what to include or not to include. If you open a Japanese newspaper, you will often see 4 or 5 different types of writing in one sentence, if you will. So you'll often see the English language right beside katakana, right beside hiragana, right beside kanji. So those last 3 are different forms of the Japanese written language, and they're used for different purposes. But you often have all of these in a paragraph in the newspaper, for example. So I found the Japanese language to be fascinating, and it's a very useful language as well because of the characters. I could easily wander about China and at least deduce some of the meaning due to the fact that they're similar. They're not identical, but they're similar enough.
I have another question here about language. Are the children taught English at elementary levels?
Yes. In fact, I meant to mention that. Again, I would say that greater than 90% of all public school students learn English from elementary school all the way through high school. So yes, English is a huge priority.
So looking for your recommendation, if we were to visit Japan, do you recommend we find a tour guide type of person to show us around, or would we be able to make our way around Japan on our own?
I think you'd be able to make your way around on your own. English is actually on all signs. Even if you're in extremely remote villages, you're going to see place names in both English and Japanese. And the Japanese people are very warm. Sometimes there might be a little timidity, but Japanese people are very warm, very kind, very helpful. And with a lot of the technology that we have at our disposal now, you can also easily do some more complicated translations if necessary. And there's a lot of exciting apps out there where you can simply speak into it and it'll convert it into Japanese. So it also depends kind of on your appetite for adventure, right? If you're comfortable traveling solo, I think it would be very rewarding in Japan because you're definitely going to get off the beaten path. And in so doing, you'll have a more genuine experience, in my opinion. One of the things I learned about living in Japan was what it feels like to be an outsider. I was often called an outsider. There's a term for non-Japanese, and it's gaijin, and the literal translation is outsider. And even though there are a lot of non-Japanese living in the larger cities, there are very few Japanese or non-Japanese living in rural Japan. So it wouldn't be uncommon for me to be on a train or biking and have kids, grandmas, people point to me, literally point to me and say, gaijin da, outsider. So that was a very eye-opening, very important, very formative experience for me to know that feeling.
Speaking of getting around, what is travel like outside of the bigger cities? Car rental, bus, train?
I would encourage train, and I meant to discuss this as well. So a lot of people know the Shinkansen, which is the incredibly fast, high-speed rail line that connects a lot of the big cities in Japan. But again, I live in Bacchus, a very small community. If we were suddenly in Japan, there's no doubt that Bacchus would have a train station and probably 5 to 7 trains on a daily basis. So you can go almost anywhere in Japan by train. There are very few places that are truly inaccessible by train. The rail network, you can literally set your watch by it. It's reliable, it's safe. Japan is an incredibly safe country.
This is a very good question. The title of your presentation implies you nearly decided to stay in Japan. What led you to return to the United States?
I wasn't sure if I was going to get asked that one, but I'm prepared for it. The truth is that I probably would have stayed, but I was blessed and fortunate enough to meet my wife in Japan. And she's from California.
So I have a friend whose father came here from Japan in the first grade. His parents were told that he would be unable to be proficient in English if he continued to learn Japanese. However, both languages are learned in Japan. So why do you think this happened?
I think that bilingualism or trilingualism is a great skill. So I guess I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to react to that one. I always encourage people to learn languages if able.
And the last questions are, so a couple, first of all, what was your Japanese breakfast this morning besides, you mentioned rice, correct?
I did. This morning I had a big bowl of rice, a big bowl of miso shiro, which is miso soup, which is a bean paste that's turned into soup, and it often contains some veggies and tofu, and then also some pickled Japanese vegetables, and nori, which is again that seaweed, and you mix that seaweed in with the rice, and some green tea.
Sounds
so
great.
Perfect Japanese breakfast.
Maybe people are getting hungry now because we have this over the noon hour. The last question, did your time in Japan have a lasting influence on your lifestyle?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Immeasurable ways that I'm probably cognizant of and ways that I'm probably less cognizant of. But it was an incredibly formative experience, and I'm very much looking forward to going back as well. It's in my DNA now, without a doubt.
Yeah, well, this presentation was just wonderful. I took so many notes, but of course they're a mess. I did have another question, but I'll save that for a later time about, just watching the Soji and personal responsibility. And I know we have, I guess I can ask it really quickly. We have this sense that we wouldn't want someone to get hurt because someone might be brought to court here in this country. Maybe someone would get sued. We had a Cultural Thursday previously about there's always someone to blame for an accident. I think this was in South Asia and Singapore. Was there a sense of communal responsibility like that? Or was there anything where individuals were held more responsible for their actions that you saw, or was it more communal? That's probably a terrible way of asking that. But
no, I don't think so. I would definitely describe Japan as a very communal approach to a wide variety of things. You see it in the schools, in business, in municipalities, and it's also a less litigious country. And I didn't understand the legal system as well as I understood the educational system, but I understood it enough to know that there are less opportunities for litigation of that nature. And I think that it's just a cost benefit ratio, right? What's the benefit of the students having this sense of ownership and shared responsibility for the school, as opposed to any potential risk or threat. I'm sure that, you know, during the recess hour playing football or soccer or judo is probably more dangerous than cleaning the school.
Right, right. And so what a teamwork, right? And what a better place to have the Olympics in the coming year. So how do you say thank you in Japanese? I'm sorry, I do not know.
どうもありがとうございました。
Wow. That's what we say to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you around school.
Sounds good, Tracy.
Jason. Take care.
Be well, everyone.
Bye, everyone.